The smell hit me first when I opened my apartment door that Christmas Eve. Something wrong beneath the familiar scent of pine from the small tree I had put up more from obligation than joy. Cold air, sharp and invasive, as if winter itself had broken through my windows. My breath caught. The door had been locked. I was certain it had been locked. My keys trembled in my hand as I stepped inside, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I had stopped listening to self-preservation a long time ago, around the same time I started hunting monsters who stole children. The living room was a disaster. Papers everywhere, scattered across the floor like snow, my careful files torn from their folders and spread with deliberate chaos. I recognized the case numbers, the photographs of missing children whose faces haunted my sleep. 3 months of investigation, gone through by hands that had no right to touch them. My laptop sat open on the coffee table, screen dark but moved from where I had left it. Someone had been here. Someone had touched everything. My stomach twisted as I moved closer, crouching to gather the files with shaking fingers, and that was when I saw them. Photographs of me. Not official ones, not the kind from a work badge or social media. Surveillance photos. Me leaving my office. Me at the grocery store. Me sitting in my car outside the warehouse on 5th Street, where I had been watching suspected trafficking activity. Whoever took these had been following me for weeks, and I had never noticed, too focused on my targets to realize I had become one. The cold in the apartment suddenly felt less like winter and more like a living thing, wrapping around my throat. They knew. Whoever was running the trafficking ring I had been investigating, they knew about me. And this was a message, a warning, a threat. My phone rang, the sound so sudden and sharp in the violated silence that I dropped the photographs. Unknown number. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but curiosity and something darker, something reckless that had been growing in me for 3 years, made me answer. The voice that came through was distorted, mechanical, stripped of humanity. "If you want to find the missing children," the voice said, "go to the Drummond estate before midnight. Come alone." The line went dead. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear even after the silence, my mind racing. Drummond. Alexander Drummond. Everyone in the city knew that name. Whispered it with fear or respect, depending on which side of the law they lived on. Mafia boss, criminal empire, ruthless, dangerous, untouchable. And someone wanted me to walk into his home tonight, alone, with a promise about the children I had been hunting for. It was a trap. Obviously a trap. But as I looked down at the scattered faces of missing children, at the surveillance photos of myself, at the wreckage of my investigation, I knew I would go. Because if there was even a chance, even the smallest possibility, that this led to them, I would walk into hell itself. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, my heart pounding against my ribs like a prisoner beating against bars, knowing I might not come back but unable to stop myself from trying. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The Drummond estate rose from the winter darkness like something from a nightmare, all iron gates and stone walls that promised no one left without permission. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I approached, headlights cutting through falling snow, and I wondered if I was driving toward answers or my own execution. Armed men materialized from the shadows before I even reached the gate, their weapons visible and intentional, a reminder that I was entering a world where violence was currency and mercy was a weakness no one could afford. They searched my car with efficient thoroughness, found nothing because I had brought nothing except my desperation and the reckless hope that had gotten me into trouble my entire career. One of them, broad-shouldered with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, gestured for me to follow, and I stepped out into the cold, my breath forming clouds that disappeared as quickly as my courage. The house itself was massive, All dark wood and darker windows, the kind of wealth that came from controlling what others feared. Inside, the warmth hit me first, then the silence, heavy and expectant, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do. The man led me through hallways lined with art that probably cost more than I would make in a lifetime, past rooms that felt empty despite their furniture, and I realized this was not a home, but a fortress, beautiful and cold and lonely. Then I saw him. Alexander Drummond stood at the end of the hall, and every warning I had ever heard about him crystallized into understanding. Tall, maybe 6 feet 2 inches, with dark hair that looked like he had run his hands through it too many times and eyes so blue they seemed almost unnatural in the dim lighting. He wore a black shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with scars that told stories of violence survived, and he moved with the controlled grace of someone who had learned to turn his body into a weapon. But it was what he carried that stopped my heart. A child. Small, maybe 5 years old, with tangled brown hair and a face too pale against his dark shirt. She was sleeping, or unconscious, I could not tell which, and the way he held her, careful and uncertain, as if she might shatter, seemed impossibly gentle for a man whose reputation was built on brutality. His eyes locked on mine, and I felt the impact of that gaze like a physical thing, sharp and assessing, looking for weakness or threat. He walked toward me, and I saw the note then, pinned to the child's shirt with a safety pin, white paper stark against faded pink fabric. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that I could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, and he turned the child slightly so I could read the words written in block letters, deliberate and mocking. "I'm your second chance." My breath caught because I knew that face. Sophia Martinez, 5 years old, missing for 2 weeks from a foster home in the South District, one of my cases, one of the children I had been hunting for. I looked up at Alexander, and his expression was winter itself, cold and merciless. "Tell me why someone left this child under my Christmas tree," he said, his voice low and controlled and absolutely lethal, "and explain why the note has your handwriting." "That is not my handwriting," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, considering a man who could end my life with a phone call was staring at me with eyes that promised violence. Alexander's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath skin that looked like it had forgotten softness, and he shifted the child slightly, still careful despite his obvious anger. "Someone is setting us both up," I continued, taking a step closer, even though every survival instinct screamed at me to run. My apartment was broken into tonight. My files on missing children, including her, were scattered everywhere. I received a call telling me to come here. I pulled out my phone with slow movements, aware of how many guns were probably trained on me from shadows I could not see, and showed him the call log. "Unknown number. Midnight deadline." He stared at the screen, and something flickered across his face, calculation mixing with suspicion. And then he looked at the note again, his eyes narrowing. "The handwriting is similar to yours," he said, "but you are right. It is not exact. Someone copied your style." The admission did not make me feel safer. It meant someone had access to my handwriting, my cases, my life, and had orchestrated this entire night to put me in a room with the most dangerous man in the city while holding a stolen child. Before I could respond, the little girl stirred in his arms, her eyes opening slowly. Unfocused and glazed with whatever drugs they had used to keep her quiet. She saw Alexander first, and terror flooded her small face, her mouth opening in a silent scream, because I knew from her file that Sophia had stopped speaking 6 months ago after whatever trauma had broken something inside her. She thrashed in his arms, and he froze, clearly unprepared for a frightened child, his hands hovering awkwardly as if he wanted to help but had forgotten how. I moved without thinking, closing the distance between us, and reached for her. "Sophia," I said softly, my social worker voice, the one I used for broken children and shattered trust. "Sophia, my name is Eleanor. You are safe now. She turned to me, recognition flickering in her dark eyes. And then she lunged from Alexander's arms into mine, her small body trembling violently, fingers clutching my coat with desperate strength. I caught her, wrapping my arms around her thin frame, feeling every rib through her dirty shirt, and my heart cracked because this child weighed almost nothing and had seen things no one should survive. Alexander stepped back, and I saw something shift in his expression, the cold calculation melting into something rawer, something that looked almost like pain. She trusts you, he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of threat. That tells me what I need to know. You did not send her, but someone wants us both involved in whatever this is. I looked up at him while holding the trembling child. An understanding passed between us, unspoken and unwelcome. We were both being manipulated, drawn into something larger and more dangerous than either of us had anticipated. You are not leaving, he said, but it was not quite a threat anymore. Not until we figure out who did this and why. You will stay here tonight. Help me keep her calm. Then we find who is playing games with us both. I should have argued, should have demanded my freedom. But Sophia whimpered against my shoulder, and I felt the weight of responsibility settle over me like chains I had chosen long ago. Fine, I said, but I am not your prisoner. I am your temporary ally. Nothing more. His mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, dangerous and knowing. We will see, he said, and gestured toward a room off the main hall. The guest room is through there. I will have my men bring supplies for the child. He turned to walk away, then paused, looking back at me with those impossibly blue eyes. And Miss Ashford, welcome to my home. I hope you survive the night. As he disappeared into the shadows of his fortress, I looked around at the cold mansion, noticing for the first time the Christmas tree standing alone in the corner of the vast room, decorated simply with white lights and nothing else, as if someone had put it up out of muscle memory, but could not remember why the ritual mattered anymore. And I wondered what kind of lonely grief lived in a man who controlled everything, but could not escape his own ghosts. The guest room was warmer than the rest of the house, as if someone had prepared it specifically for comfort, and I settled Sophia on the bed, pulling soft blankets around her thin shoulders while she watched me with eyes too old for her small face. She did not sleep, just stared at the ceiling with that terrible awareness that came from surviving things childhood should never contain. And I sat beside her, humming softly, running my hand over her tangled hair until her breathing finally steadied into something like rest. Hours passed in that quiet vigil, the clock on the wall marking time with soft clicks, and I became aware of him before I saw him, that prickling sensation of being watched by someone who had made surveillance an art form. Alexander stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and in the dim light from the bedside lamp, I could see his knuckles were indeed scarred, white lines cutting across tan skin, the kind of damage that came from hitting things harder than flesh should ever strike. He moved like water, silent and controlled, crossing the room to stand near the window, keeping distance between us, as if he did not trust himself or me, or the strange situation that had forced us into alliance. I studied him while he looked out at the snow falling over his fortress, noticing how his shoulders carried tension like armor, how his jaw stayed tight even in profile, and I wondered what it cost a man to build walls so high that even standing in his own home, he could not relax. Sophia whimpered, a small sound of distress, and before I could react, Alexander turned and retrieved a blanket from the chair, bringing it to me without a word, his movements efficient, but not unkind. Our fingers brushed as I took it from him, and I felt the calluses on his hands, the heat of his skin, and something electric passed between us that I absolutely could not afford to acknowledge. I draped the blanket over Sophia and she settled, her small hand reaching out to grip my sleeve, And when I looked up, Alexander was watching her with an expression that cracked something in my chest because it was naked grief, raw and unguarded for just a moment before he locked it away again. "The note," I said quietly, not wanting to wake the child, but needing answers more than I needed safety. "You reacted to the phrase second chance like it meant something specific. Tell me why." He was silent so long I thought he would not answer, his jaw working as if the words were fighting their way past barricades built over years. And then he spoke, his voice low and rough like gravel under tires. "I had a sister," he said, staring at Sophia instead of me. "Grace. 8 years younger than me. She was 12 when they killed her. A rival family, sending a message about territory and respect and all the things men destroy each other over. I was supposed to protect her. That was my job, my only job that mattered. And I failed." His hands curled into fists at his sides, those scarred knuckles going white with pressure. "My mother never recovered. She died 6 months later, just stopped eating, stopped living, and the last thing she said to me was that everyone deserves a second chance at saving what matters. She was telling me to forgive myself. I never could." The pain in his voice was a living thing, sharp and consuming, and I understood then why this house felt like a tomb, why the Christmas tree stood alone without joy, why a man who controlled an empire of violence and fear looked so utterly lost, holding a frightened child. And against every bit of professional distance and self-preservation I had left, I felt my heart break for him. His confession hung in the air between us, heavy with old grief and newer understanding, and I knew then that I could not withhold my own story, not when he had stripped himself bare in this quiet room with a sleeping child as our only witness. "I had a case 3 years ago," I said, and my voice cracked on the words, because speaking Emma's name aloud still felt like swallowing glass. "A little girl named Emma Chen, 6 years old, placed in foster care after her mother died of an overdose. I was her caseworker. She was so bright, always drawing pictures of houses with gardens and families holding hands, and I thought I had found her a good placement, a couple who seemed kind and patient and everything she needed." I stopped, the memory rising like bile, and Alexander moved closer, not touching, but present, his attention absolute. "2 weeks after placement, she disappeared. The foster parents said she ran away, but I knew something was wrong because Emma would not run. She was too desperate for stability, for someone to keep her. But I could not prove anything. The police investigated and found nothing. The case went cold. My supervisor told me to let it go, that some children cannot be saved, and I have hated those words every day since." Alexander made a sound low in his throat, recognition and anger mixed, and when I looked up, his eyes were burning with an intensity that should have frightened me, but instead made me feel seen for the first time in years. "You have been hunting them ever since," he said, and it was not a question. "The trafficking ring. You think they took her?" I nodded, feeling tears burn behind my eyes, but refusing to let them fall because I had cried enough for Emma in the dark hours when no one watched, and crying did not bring her back. I started investigating on my own time, looking for patterns in missing foster children, placements that went wrong, caseworkers who seemed too eager to close files without proper follow-up. I found connections, threads that linked back to organized networks. But every time I got close, someone would shut me down, block my access, transfer cases away from me. My supervisor, Catherine, said I was becoming obsessive, that I needed to focus on the children I could help instead of ghosts. But I could not stop, because Emma is not a ghost. She is a little girl who trusted me and I failed her, and if I stop looking, then she dies for real, not just in the system, but in reality. And I cannot live with that. My voice had risen without my permission, all the fury and guilt and desperate hope pouring out like poison from a wound, and Alexander reached out then, his scarred hand covering mine where it gripped the blanket, his touch careful as if I were something breakable. "You sound like me," he said quietly. And there was no judgment in it, only understanding that cut deeper than sympathy ever could. Punishing yourself for not being perfect, for not saving someone when you were set up to fail. Someone wanted Emma taken. Someone protected the people who took her. You were never going to win that fight alone. The validation should not have mattered, should not have reached past my walls. But it did, and I felt something crack inside me. The prison I had built from guilt finally showing fractures. Before either of us could say more, the door opened and James entered, his expression grim and alert, and I saw Alexander's entire demeanor shift in an instant, the vulnerable man disappearing behind the crime lord's mask. "We have a problem," James said, his eyes flicking to me with barely concealed suspicion. "Someone breached the outer perimeter security 2 hours ago, planted the child, and disappeared without triggering alarms. Professional work. Whoever did this knows our systems." Alexander stood, his body going taut with controlled violence, and I watched him transform into something cold and deadly. "They are still watching," he said, and it was not a question. James nodded. We swept for devices and found 3 cameras positioned to monitor the front entrance and this wing of the house. Someone wants to see what we do next. The implications settled over me like ice water, and I looked down at Sophia sleeping peacefully, finally safe in this moment, and realized that safety was an illusion, because whoever orchestrated this night had resources and knowledge and purpose, and they were not finished with us yet. The house transformed within minutes, from silent fortress to operational command center. And I watched Alexander become someone else entirely, moving through rooms issuing orders in a clipped tone that brooked no argument, while men materialized from shadows carrying weapons and technology I tried not to examine too closely. James set up laptops in the dining room, screens flickering with security feeds and maps, and I stood awkwardly near the doorway until Alexander turned to me with an expression that said he was deciding whether I was asset or liability. "I have information you need," I said before he could speak, forcing my voice steady despite my racing heart. "About the trafficking network. I have been tracking patterns for 2 years, connections between foster placements and disappearances, names of caseworkers who close files too quickly, locations where children were last seen. If someone is watching us, if they went to this much trouble to put Sophia here, then they are part of the network I have been hunting, and I can help you find them." His eyes narrowed, calculating, and I saw him weighing options with the cold efficiency of a man who had built an empire on reading people correctly. "You are a social worker, not an investigator," he said, but there was question in it, rather than dismissal. "What makes you think your information is worth the risk of keeping you involved?" "Because I have been inside the system they are using," I replied, stepping closer to the table covered in documents and forcing myself into the space he occupied with such casual dominance. "I know how they hide, how they manipulate paperwork, how they select vulnerable children no one will search for too hard. Your men can find physical locations, but I can identify the people protecting this operation from the inside. And you need both if you want to dismantle it completely, instead of just cutting off one head of a hydra that will grow back." Something shifted in his expression, respect maybe, or recognition of someone as obsessed as himself. And he nodded once before gesturing to the chair beside his. James looked like he wanted to protest, but Alexander silenced him with a glance, and I sat down, pulling out my phone and opening the encrypted files I had compiled in secret, afraid my supervisor would discover them and delete years of work. Our hands brushed as I slid the phone across the table, and the contact was electric, unexpected heat that shot up my arm and made my breath catch. And when I looked up, Alexander was watching me with an intensity that had nothing to do with the investigation, and everything to do with the awareness crackling between us like static before a storm. He pulled his hand back, professional distance reasserting itself, but I had seen his pupils dilate, had felt the momentary freeze before he withdrew, and I knew he felt it too, this unwelcome attraction blooming in the worst possible moment between two people who had no business wanting each other. "Focus," he said, his voice rougher than before, and I nodded, pushing away thoughts of his scarred hands and the way he had held that blanket so carefully. James pulled up building schematics while I explained the pattern of disappearances, and we worked through the night building a picture of an organization that used legitimate child services as hunting grounds. And somewhere in the guest room above us, Sophia slept, the living proof of everything we were fighting. And I caught Alexander looking toward the ceiling twice as if he could see through walls to where the child dreamed. And each time his expression cracked just slightly, revealing the man who did not know how to be gentle anymore, but desperately wanted to remember. James found the location 2 hours before dawn, a warehouse district along the industrial stretch of river where legitimate shipping operations provided cover for darker transactions, and Alexander was moving before the address finished displaying on the screen, grabbing keys and a weapon in movements so practiced they looked like breathing. I stood too, ignoring the exhaustion dragging at my bones because sleep was impossible when we were this close to answers. And when Alexander turned to tell me I was staying behind, I met his eyes with every ounce of stubborn determination I possessed, and said simply that he could waste time arguing, or we could go now. And after a moment where something almost like admiration flickered across his face, he nodded once and gestured toward the door. James protested, his concern obvious as he listed reasons why bringing me was tactical insanity, but Alexander cut him off with a look that said the decision was final, and minutes later, I was sliding into the passenger seat of a black car that probably cost more than my annual salary, the leather interior smelling of expensive cologne and gun oil, and the door closed with a solid thunk that felt like sealing us into our own private world. The drive took 20 minutes through empty pre-dawn streets, and I was acutely aware of Alexander beside me, his hands steady on the wheel, his jaw tight with focus. And the space between us felt charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the investigation, and everything to do with the way his shoulder nearly touched mine when he shifted gears, the way I could feel heat radiating from his body in the close confines of the car. "You do not have to prove anything," he said quietly without looking at me, his voice rough in the darkness. "I know you are capable. I understand why this matters to you. But if the situation turns dangerous, I need you to follow my instructions without question because I cannot do what needs doing if I am worried about your safety." The admission surprised me, his concern obvious despite the controlled delivery, and I found myself studying his profile, the hard lines of his face softened slightly by dashboard light, the way his fingers gripped the steering wheel like he was restraining himself from reaching for me instead. "I will follow your lead," I said, and meant it, because despite everything he represented, every law he had broken and violence he had committed, I trusted him in this moment more than I had trusted anyone in years, and that realization should have terrified me, but instead felt inevitable, like we had been moving toward this partnership since the moment he appeared carrying Sophia. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking shadow against the lightening sky, and Alexander parked 2 blocks away, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency before looking at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Stay behind me. Stay quiet. And if I tell you to run, you run and do not look back. Understood?" I nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs, and we moved through the cold morning air toward the building, and when he reached back to ensure I was close, his hand found mine for just a moment, warm and solid and gone too quickly. But the ghost of that touch burned through me as we approached the metal door. Inside the warehouse was abandoned chaos, tables overturned and papers scattered, and the lingering smell of fear that made my stomach clench. And Alexander moved through the space like a predator, silent and lethal, while I searched desperately for anything that might tell us where the children had gone. I found evidence of recent occupation, blankets still holding body heat, food wrappers indicating at least 6 small captives, and then in the corner beneath an overturned crate I saw it, a stuffed rabbit worn soft from years of loving, one ear sewn back on with crooked stitches, and I stopped breathing because I knew that rabbit had watched a 6-year-old girl clutch it while I promised her everything would be okay, and my hands shook as I picked up Emma's rabbit and realized she had been here, was maybe still alive, and this nightmare had been continuing for 3 years right under my nose while I searched uselessly. The rabbit slipped from my fingers, and I could not breathe, could not think past the roaring in my ears that said Emma had been here, had been alive weeks ago, maybe days ago, and all my searching had brought me nowhere, while she suffered in places I should have found. And my knees hit the concrete floor without my permission, as 3 years of carefully controlled grief crashed through every wall I had built to keep functioning. I heard Alexander say my name, his voice cutting through the static in my head, and then his hands were on my shoulders, solid and warm, pulling me up and turning me toward him, and I tried to say I was fine, that I needed to keep searching, but instead a sound came out that was half sob, half scream, and suddenly I was against his chest, his arms wrapping around me with surprising gentleness while I broke apart completely. I cried for Emma, for every child I had failed to save, for the version of myself who had believed goodness and hard work were enough to protect the innocent. And Alexander held me through it without speaking, one hand moving slowly up and down my spine, in a gesture that should have been awkward from a man who dealt in violence but instead felt like the only solid thing in a collapsing world. I stopped believing I deserved to be happy after Emma disappeared. I said into his shirt, the words muffled but necessary, spilling out with the tears I had not allowed myself for years. I stopped sleeping more than 4 hours, stopped seeing friends, stopped doing anything except hunting for her. And everyone said I needed to let go, that she was probably dead, that I was destroying myself, but letting go felt like killing her myself, like if I stopped searching then she really would be gone. Alexander pulled back just enough to look at my face, his thumbs wiping tears from my cheeks with a tenderness that made my chest ache, and his eyes held understanding that went bone deep, the recognition of someone who knew intimately what guilt tasted like. "I know," he said quietly, and I believed him because I had seen his expression when he talked about Grace, had watched him carry that failure like a physical weight. "I know what it means to keep punishing yourself because the alternative is accepting you are not powerful enough to save everyone. And I know how that punishment becomes the only thing that makes you feel like you are still fighting, even when you are just bleeding." His hands framed my face, and I leaned into that touch like a woman drowning. And he said with absolute certainty that we would find Emma, that he would use every resource he possessed and burn down anyone who stood between us and those children. And I believed him because Alexander Drummond was dangerous and ruthless and exactly the weapon I needed. We drove back to the estate in silence, his hand finding mine across the console and holding tight. And when we walked inside, we found Sophia in the sitting room with James, drawing with crayons on paper he had apparently procured from somewhere, and she looked up as we entered and held out a picture with the proud smile of a child sharing treasure. The drawing showed a woman with red hair and a building with a blue door, rendered in simple lines. And my heart stopped, because I knew that red hair had sat across from that woman 1,000 times, and Alexander saw my expression change and asked what was wrong, and I said in a voice that shook with rage and disbelief that the woman in the picture was Catherine Wilton, my supervisor, the person I had trusted with every piece of evidence I had gathered, the person who had access to every vulnerable child in the system. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had experienced, worse than finding Emma gone, worse than every failure that haunted my nights, because Catherine had been my mentor, the person I trusted with every lead and every vulnerable child, and she had been feeding me to wolves while pretending to care about the mission. And the rage that flooded through me was so hot, I thought I might combust where I stood, my hands shaking as I stared at Sophia's innocent drawing of the woman who had orchestrated so much suffering. Alexander moved immediately, phone already in his hand, his voice low and deadly as he made calls that set his entire network into motion. And I heard him say Catherine's name with a coldness that promised retribution, heard him giving orders to find her location and monitor her movements and discover everyone she had contact with, because if she was involved, then there were others. And the efficiency of his response should have frightened me, but instead felt like justice finally taking shape. James took Sophia to another room, distracting her with more paper and crayons, and once she was gone, I turned to Alexander and said that Catherine had access to every case file I had compiled, every witness I had interviewed, every piece of evidence I had gathered over 3 years, and she had probably been warning the traffickers the entire time, steering me away from real leads while I spun in circles chasing ghosts. And my voice broke on the last word, because the scope of her betrayal meant Emma had suffered longer than necessary, meant children had been taken who might have been saved if someone I trusted had not been actively sabotaging my investigation. Alexander crossed to me in 2 strides, his hands gripping my shoulders, and he said with absolute certainty that Catherine would answer for what she had done, that he would make sure of it, and I saw in his eyes the promise of violence, the ruthless calculation of a man who knew how to dismantle enemies, and I should have told him we needed her alive for testimony, should have insisted on legal process, but instead I just nodded, because part of me wanted him to hurt her the way she had hurt all those children. The day passed in tense activity, Alexander's men reporting in with information while I paced the estate like a caged animal, too angry to sit, too betrayed to rest. And when night fell, I was still wired with fury and adrenaline, my mind replaying every interaction with Catherine, searching for signs I had missed, clues that should have warned me I was trusting a monster. I could not sleep, could not even pretend to try, so I wandered the dark hallways of Alexander's mansion until I found myself outside his study, light spilling from beneath the door, and I pushed it open without knocking, because pretense felt impossible after everything we had shared. He sat at his desk, a photograph in his hands, and even from the doorway I could see it was old, the colors faded, showing a younger Alexander with his arm around a smiling girl who had his eyes. And Grace looked so alive in that frozen moment, so certain she was safe with her brother protecting her. And the expression on Alexander's face as he stared at her image was so raw it made my chest ache. "I pushed everyone away after she died," he said without looking up, his voice rough with old pain. "I built walls made of violence and control, turned myself into something that could not be hurt again, because feeling anything was too dangerous. And for 8 years I have existed in this space where nothing touches me, where I make decisions without conscience and sleep without dreams. And it worked until you walked into my home with your impossible hope and refusal to surrender. And suddenly I am feeling everything again, and I do not know if I remember how to be human." I crossed to him, my anger at Catherine fading in the face of his vulnerability, and I touched his face, my fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. And he leaned into my palm, like a man starving for gentleness, his eyes closing, and the moment stretched between us electric and inevitable, and I was leaning closer when Sophia's scream shattered the silence, high and terrified, and we both moved instantly, the almost kiss evaporating as we ran toward her room where nightmares had found her even in this protected space. James called at dawn with news that turned my exhausted worry into cold tactical focus. Catherine had been spotted meeting Robert Sinclair at a restaurant on the waterfront, the kind of place where criminals conducted business behind a veneer of legitimacy, and surveillance photos showed them reviewing documents and talking with the ease of long association, which meant the trafficking operation was not just protected by my supervisor, but actively run by Alexander's rival, the man who had been circling his territory for months looking for weakness. Alexander stood at the head of his dining table, reviewing the intelligence his men had gathered through the night, his face carved from stone, and when he spoke, his voice carried the lethal certainty of someone planning warfare, laying out a raid on Sinclair's known properties, identifying targets, assigning teams, and I listened to him organize violence with brutal efficiency until I could not stay silent anymore, and said we needed evidence that would hold up in court, that rushing in with guns would save some children but let the network survive, let other monsters step into Sinclair's place and continue the operation under new management. He looked at me with frustration tightening his jaw and said his way was faster, that every moment we spent gathering evidence was another moment those children suffered, and I understood his rage, felt it burning in my own chest, but I insisted that we needed Catherine's confession on record, needed documentation that would dismantle the entire system, and his hands slammed on the table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups, as he said I was asking him to risk everything on legal process that had failed those children already, that had let Catherine operate for years while people like me trusted the system to protect the innocent. We faced each other across polished wood, two people with the same goal and completely different methods, and I saw in his eyes the warlord who had built an empire on decisive action, who solved problems by eliminating them, while he saw in me the idealist who still believed justice meant something beyond revenge. And the argument spiraled between us, voices rising, until small hands tugged at both our sleeves and we looked down to find Sophia watching us with solemn eyes. And she took my hand in her left and Alexander's in her right and brought them together, pressing our palms flat against each other with the gentle insistence of a child who understood that fighting would not save anyone. The gesture disarmed us completely, the anger draining from the room as Alexander's fingers curled around mine and I felt the calluses on his palm, the strength he had been ready to unleash tempered by the trust of a traumatized girl who had chosen us both as her protectors. And he said quietly that we would find a way to do this together, using his resources and my knowledge. And I nodded because Sophia was right, because divided we would fail, but together we might actually save them all. We spent the next 2 days planning with the precision of a military operation, Alexander's tactical mind, and my knowledge of Catherine's routines, creating a strategy that balanced his need for action with my insistence on evidence. And James brought in a tech specialist who fitted me with a wire so thin I could barely feel it against my skin, the recording device hidden in the lining of my jacket, and we rehearsed the confrontation until I could recite the questions that would draw out Catherine's confession without making her suspicious, though my hands shook every time I imagined facing the woman who had betrayed everything I believed in. Alexander insisted on positioning his men around the Child Services building, close enough to intervene, but far enough to avoid spooking Catherine, while simultaneously coordinating a team to surround Sinclair's primary warehouse, the place his intelligence suggested held the children currently in transit, and the complexity of executing both operations simultaneously made my head spin. But Alexander moved through the logistics with calm certainty, his commands precise, his contingency plans layered, and I realized he had been managing this kind of coordinated violence for years, that the ruthless efficiency I had judged was also the skill set that might actually save those children. The night before we were set to move, I could not eat, could not focus, my mind cycling through everything that could go wrong. And I checked on Sophia 3 times before she finally fell asleep, her small hand clutching the stuffed bear Alexander had bought her. And when I turned from her doorway, he was standing in the hallway watching me with an expression that made my breath catch, because there was something raw in his face, something vulnerable and fierce simultaneously. He took my hand without a word and led me to his study, closing the door behind us. And then his hands were framing my face, and he said that I had awakened something in him he thought was dead, that for 8 years he had moved through the world like a ghost going through motions, and I had reminded him what it felt like to want something beyond revenge, to believe there was purpose in protecting rather than destroying, and his voice was rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. I admitted I was terrified of losing someone again, that every person I let myself care about seemed to slip through my fingers, but he was worth the risk, worth choosing hope over the safe isolation I had built around my damaged heart, and when his mouth found mine, the kiss was urgent and desperate, carrying the weight of everything we might lose tomorrow, and I kissed him back with the same fierce need, my hands tangling in his hair, his body solid and warm against mine, and for those suspended moments, nothing existed except the taste of him and the knowledge that this complicated, dangerous man had become essential to me in ways I could not fully name. We broke apart, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, and he whispered a promise that he would keep me safe tomorrow, that I would walk out of that building alive, and I made him promise the same because I could not survive finding what I was worth living for, only to lose it to bullets and blood. I walked into Catherine's office at 3 in the afternoon when I knew she would be alone, my heart a thunder in my chest that threatened to drown out rational thought, and she looked up from her desk with that familiar warm smile that now turned my stomach because I knew what hid behind it, and I closed the door carefully while the wire pressed against my ribs recording every word, every breath. I told her I needed to talk about the missing children cases, about inconsistencies I had found in the files, and I watched her expression shift from welcoming to wary as she asked what inconsistencies, her hand moving toward her desk drawer in a gesture that made my pulse spike with alarm. I said I knew about her meetings with Robert Sinclair, that I had evidence of her involvement, and I needed to understand why, giving her the opening to explain or deny. And for a long moment she just stared at me, before something cold and ugly settled over her features, like a mask dropping away to reveal the monster underneath. And she laughed, actually laughed, a sound without humor that made my skin crawl. She said I was always too naive, too trusting, that I walked around believing the system worked when it was rotten from the inside, and she had simply been smart enough to profit from that rot. That over 4 years she had helped move more than 30 children through Sinclair's network, placed them in foster situations that made them vulnerable, erased records that might have saved them. My hands clenched into fists as she listed her crimes with pride, and I asked about Emma, forcing her name through the rage closing my throat. And Catherine smiled with vicious satisfaction and said Emma had been one of the first, a pretty little thing who brought a premium price. And she had enjoyed watching me torture myself with guilt over losing her when the child had been sold before I ever had a chance to intervene. The confession spilled from her with the relief of someone who had been hiding too long, who wanted to gloat about her cleverness. And I thought about Alexander listening to this through the earpiece his tech specialist had provided, about James positioned in the hallway, about the children suffering because of this woman's greed, and when Catherine opened her desk drawer and pulled out a gun, my body froze with primal terror even as my mind screamed at me to move. She said I should have stayed blind and compliant like a good little social worker, that my investigation had made me a liability, and I saw her finger tighten on the trigger in slow motion, saw my death in her cold eyes, and then the door exploded inward as James crashed through with controlled violence, his weapon trained on Catherine, and she turned toward him, giving me the split second to dive behind the chair as her shot went wild and James returned fire, disarming her with a precision that shattered her wrist and sent the gun skittering across the floor. Across the city in a warehouse by the docks, Alexander was breaching Sinclair's facility with the full force of his organization, and through the chaos of Catherine's screaming and James securing her, I heard gunfire over the open channel, heard Alexander's voice sharp with command, and then a sound that stopped my heart, the impact of a bullet and his grunt of pain, and I was running before conscious thought caught up, James calling after me that the building was secure, but I could not stop because Alexander had taken a hit protecting those children, and I needed to see him alive, needed to know the man I loved had survived the violence we had unleashed together. I reached the warehouse district in 20 minutes that should have taken 40, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, and the scene that greeted me was controlled chaos. Police cars surrounding the building with lights blazing, ambulances lined up with paramedics moving between them, and Alexander's men melting into shadows before the authorities could ask questions they would not want to answer. I abandoned my car and ran toward the closest paramedic, demanding to know about gunshot victims, and he pointed toward an ambulance where I could see James standing guard, his face grim. and my heart was a wild thing trying to escape my chest as I shoved past him to find Alexander sitting on the back edge of the vehicle, his shirt soaked with blood, a paramedic working on his shoulder while he argued about refusing transport to the hospital. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled, and his eyes found mine across the space, something fierce and alive in his gaze despite the pain bracketing his mouth, and I was moving toward him without conscious decision, my hands reaching for his face as the paramedic protested that I needed to let him work. Alexander caught my wrist with his good hand and pulled me closer, telling me he was fine. It went through clean, and I wanted to scream at him for getting shot, for scaring me, for making me love him enough that the thought of losing him carved me hollow. But instead, I pressed my forehead to his and breathed him in while my hands shook against his blood-warm skin. James cleared his throat and reported that Sinclair was dead, killed in the firefight when he tried to shoot the children Alexander had positioned himself to shield. And the rest of his operation had surrendered when they realized they were outgunned, and the police had found 12 children in various states of trauma, but alive. All of them alive, because Alexander had moved with the kind of controlled violence that saved rather than destroyed. The lead detective approached asking questions about anonymous tips and who exactly had breached the facility first, and Alexander met his gaze with calm certainty and said he had received information about children in danger and acted to protect them. That if the detective had a problem with dead traffickers, he was welcome to file a complaint. And there was enough cold authority in his voice that the detective backed off, perhaps recognizing that prosecuting the man who saved 12 children would be a political nightmare. I heard my name called and turned to see Emma being loaded into an ambulance, 9 years old now with haunted eyes and tangled hair, and I ran to her as the paramedic allowed me close. And when she recognized me, she started crying, saying my name over and over, and I was crying too, holding her careful of her fragile body, telling her she was safe now. I had found her. I would never let anyone hurt her again. Alexander watched from his ambulance, his expression soft with something that looked like wonder, and when I finally returned to him carrying the weight of 3 years of guilt transformed into gratitude, he pulled me down beside him and said I had given him something more valuable than revenge, that watching me reunite with the child I had mourned had shown him what purpose looked like, what redemption might feel like if he was brave enough to reach for it. 2 weeks after the raid, I sat in the district attorney's office watching Alexander face questions about the violence that had saved 12 children, and the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on as the prosecutor detailed potential charges ranging from unlawful entry to assault with a deadly weapon. And I knew that without intervention, the man who had risked everything to stop a trafficking ring would be punished for the methods he used, even though those methods had worked when the system failed. I testified for over an hour about my investigation, about how I had exhausted legal channels and been stonewalled at every turn by Catherine's interference, about how Alexander's resources and willingness to act had been the only thing standing between those children and continued horror, and I watched the prosecutor's expression shift from stern certainty to reluctant consideration as I laid out the timeline of failures that had made Alexander's intervention necessary. The deal they offered was not mercy, but pragmatism. Alexander would legitimize his business operations, transitioning from the gray areas of his empire into legal security and protection services, and he would cooperate with future investigations into organized crime, providing information that could dismantle other networks without compromising his own safety. Alexander sat across the desk, with his arm still in a sling from the bullet wound, his face unreadable. And when he finally spoke, he said he would agree to their terms, that he was ready to change. And I saw something in his eyes that looked like relief, as if he had been waiting for permission to step away from the violence that had defined him since Grace's death. When we left the building together, the winter sun was bright and cold. And Alexander turned to me on the courthouse steps and asked if I thought he could really do this, if a man with his history could build something legitimate. And I took his hand and told him I had seen him protect children at the cost of his own blood, had watched him gentle himself around Sophia's fear, and if he could do those things, he could do anything. That afternoon, I brought Sophia to visit him at the estate, and the moment she saw him, she ran across the entrance hall calling his name, not the formal Alexander, but Alex, the syllables clear and bright in her small voice, and he caught her with his good arm and lifted her carefully, his face transformed by wonder, because this child who had been silent with trauma was speaking, was choosing him as someone safe and worthy of her trust. I had begun the foster certification process for Sophia, and Alexander had been a constant presence through every appointment and evaluation. And as I watched him carry her toward the sitting room, where he had set up a collection of toys and books, I felt my heart expand with a hope I had thought lost forever. He set Sophia down to play, and then turned to me with an expression vulnerable and uncertain, and he said he wanted to be part of our lives if I would have him, that he knew he had no right to ask after everything he had been, but that Sophia had given him a reason to become better, and I had shown him what better might look like, and he would spend however long it took proving he could be the man we deserved. I woke on Christmas morning to winter light filtering through curtains that actually softened the brightness, instead of the heavy drapes that had made Alexander's estate feel like a fortress when I first arrived a year ago. And the transformation of this place mirrored the transformation of the man whose arm was draped across my waist, his breathing deep and even beside me in the bed we now shared without fear or hesitation. The sound of small feet pounding down the hallway gave me only seconds of warning before Sophia burst through the door, 6 years old now and incandescent with excitement, her dark curls wild around her face as she launched herself onto the bed, shouting that Santa had come and there were so many presents, and we had to come see right now. Alexander caught her mid-flight with a laugh that still surprised me sometimes. The sound of genuine joy from a man who had forgotten how to feel it, and he pulled her into a hug that made her giggle before setting her on her feet and promising we would be downstairs in 5 minutes. She raced off to presumably inspect the packages again, and Alexander turned to me with eyes still soft from sleep, his hand coming up to cup my face as he kissed me slow and thorough, the kind of kiss that said we had all the time in the world now, no more countdowns to raids or desperate embraces before danger. He rose to make coffee while I dressed, and I found him in the kitchen that had once been industrial and cold, but now held Sophia's drawings on the refrigerator and the scent of cinnamon from the rolls he had learned to bake because she loved them. We carried our mugs to the living room where the Christmas tree stood magnificent and properly decorated, not the lonely sparse thing from that first night, but a tree dressed by people who understood they were building traditions worth keeping. Sophia was vibrating with impatience beside a mountain of wrapped gifts, and as she tore into them with the unself-conscious delight of a child who finally felt safe enough to want things, I leaned into Alexander's side and felt his arm settle around my shoulders like it belonged there. The doorbell rang at 10, and I opened it to find Emma with her adoptive parents, her face still cautious but smiling, healing slower than Sophia, but healing nonetheless, and she hugged me tight before heading to join Sophia in the chaos of wrapping paper and ribbon. Alexander's security company had grown into something legitimate and respected, his past carefully buried under the weight of good works and strategic donations, and my position as Director of Child Services meant we could funnel resources where they were needed most, could protect children. The system had failed. James stopped by with gifts and stayed for breakfast. His initial suspicion of the changes in Alexander's life transformed into something like pride as he watched his boss become someone who smiled without calculation. As afternoon light slanted golden through windows and Sophia showed Emma her new books, Alexander pulled me aside near the tree and wrapped his arms around me from behind, his chin resting on my shoulder as he whispered that I had been his second chance. That the note pinned to Sophia's shirt that impossible Christmas Eve had been right in ways neither of us could have imagined, and he would spend every day of his life earning the trust I had given him. I turned in his arms and kissed him surrounded by the laughter of children who had survived horror and found home, and told him he had already earned it 1,000 times over. That we had saved each other as surely as we had saved Sophia and Emma, that this family forged from brokenness and blood was the greatest gift either of us would ever receive. The note had promised him a second chance, and Sophia had delivered redemption neither of us believed we deserved, but in the end, we had given each other something more valuable than absolution. We had given each other love built on shared scars and mutual understanding, a future neither of us had to face alone.